In the suffocating darkness of a 1600s European cellar, young Theodore's hands shake as he grinds mercury with lead, the toxic fumes searing his lungs while his master, a royal mathematician, screams corrections from above. His fingers are stained purple from handling unknown compounds. His back bears fresh welts from yesterday's beating for questioning a calculation, and his stomach gnaws with hunger. He hasn't eaten in 2 days because he accidentally broke a prized astrolabe. This is learning in the age of genius worship, where knowledge comes at the cost of humanity, where brilliance justifies brutality, and where the price of wisdom is measured in suffering. But it wasn't always this way. 2,000 years before Theodore's torment, in the sun-dappled groves of ancient Athens, a different kind of learning flourished. Here, in the gardens of the Academy and the covered walkways of the Lyceum, knowledge was not extracted through pain, but cultivated through joy. The relationship between teacher and student was not one of master and slave, but of gardener and seedling, of elder and younger traveler on the same path toward understanding. The Greeks understood something we have forgotten, that true learning requires not just the transmission of information, but the cultivation of the whole human being. Today, as we witness the epidemic of burnout among graduate students, the exploitation of unpaid interns, and the toxic culture of academic hazing disguised as rigor, we might wonder how we lost our way so completely. How did we transform the sacred act of mentorship into a system that devours its young? How did we mistake suffering for learning, exploitation for excellence, and trauma for transformation? The answer lies not just in understanding what went wrong, but in remembering what once went right. The ancient Greeks possessed a secret that both the brutal academies of the 1600s and our modern institutions have forgotten. Learning is not a conquest, but a conversation, not a battle, but a dance. They understood that the mind cannot be forced to grow any more than a flower can be forced to bloom. They knew that wisdom emerges not from fear, but from trust, not from isolation, but from community, not from breaking spirits, but from nurturing souls. In their approach to mentorship, they created something revolutionary, a method of human development that honored both knowledge and the knower, that valued both intellectual rigor and emotional well-being. This is the story of how we lost the art of true mentorship and how we might find it again. It begins in the marble halls of ancient Athens, where philosophy was not just an academic discipline, but a way of life, where teachers were not just information dispensers, but life guides, and where students were not just receptacles for knowledge, but active participants in the great conversation of human understanding. It's a story that reveals the profound difference between education that liberates and education that enslaves, between mentorship that empowers and mentorship that exploits. In the golden age of Athens, around 387 BCE, the city hummed with intellectual ferment. This was not the sterile, competitive atmosphere of modern universities or the fear-based learning environments of Renaissance Europe. Instead, Athens pulsed with what the Greeks called philosophia, the love of wisdom. The very word reveals their revolutionary understanding. Learning was not about acquiring power over others, but about falling in love with truth itself. The city's philosophical schools were not institutions of higher learning in our modern sense, but communities of seekers gathered around shared questions rather than predetermined answers. The physical environment itself reflected this philosophical approach. Plato's academy sat in a grove of olive trees dedicated to the hero Academus, a place where natural beauty and intellectual pursuit intertwined. Students and teachers walked together along tree-lined paths, their conversations flowing as naturally as the streams that wound through the gardens. The Lyceum, where Aristotle taught, was similarly situated in a gymnasium complex surrounded by groves and walkways. These were not ivory towers, but integrated spaces where body, mind, and spirit could develop in harmony. The social structure of these schools revealed a profound understanding of human psychology and learning. Rather than the rigid hierarchies that would characterize later educational institutions, Greek philosophical communities operated more like extended families. Teachers were not distant authorities, but accessible guides who lived alongside their students, sharing meals, participating in festivals, and engaging in the daily rhythms of community life. The relationship between mentor and student was reciprocal. Teachers learned from students even as they guided them, and students were expected to contribute to the intellectual life of the community from the beginning. This approach reflected the Greeks' understanding of human nature itself. They recognized that humans are fundamentally social beings who learn best in relationship with others. They understood that the mind develops not through isolation and individual struggle, but through dialogue, debate, and collaborative inquiry. Most importantly, they grasped that learning involves the whole person. Emotions, relationships, physical well-being, and spiritual development are all considered essential components of education. The contrast with what would come later could not be more stark. In the 1600s, as the scientific revolution gained momentum, learning became increasingly divorced from living. The medieval guild system, which had provided some structure and protection for apprentices, began to break down under the pressure of new economic forces and the cult of individual genius. Young people like Theodore found themselves bound to masters who viewed them not as developing human beings, but as tools to be used in the pursuit of knowledge and glory. The brutality of this system was not incidental, but integral to its philosophy. Knowledge was seen as something to be conquered, extracted, and hoarded. The master-apprentice relationship became one of dominance and submission, where learning was thought to require suffering, where questions were seen as insubordination, and where the apprentice's well-being was irrelevant compared to the master's research goals. This was education as colonization, the systematic subjugation of young minds in service of older ambitions. Yet even as this brutal system emerged, there were those who remembered the older ways. Some of the greatest minds of the scientific revolution, including figures like Galileo and Newton, showed flashes of the ancient understanding in their gentler moments with students. But these were exceptions in a system increasingly dominated by competition, secrecy, and exploitation. The collaborative spirit of the Greek philosophical schools gave way to the jealous guarding of knowledge. The generous sharing of wisdom was replaced by the hoarding of secrets, and the nurturing of young minds was subordinated to the advancement of individual careers. Today, we live with the consequences of this transformation. Our educational institutions, from graduate schools to corporate training programs, still bear the marks of the 1600s model. We glorify the tortured genius, celebrate the mentor who toughens up students through harsh treatment, and mistake exploitation for excellence. We have internalized the belief that learning must be painful, that growth requires trauma, and that the price of knowledge is the sacrifice of well-being. But the ancient Greeks offer us a different vision, one that is not only more humane, but more effective. Their approach to mentorship created some of the most profound thinkers in human history, established intellectual traditions that lasted for centuries, and developed a model of human development that honored both individual growth and collective wisdom. Understanding their methods offers us a path back to authentic learning, sustainable mentorship, and educational practices that serve human flourishing rather than exploiting it. Modern neuroscience has begun to validate what the ancient Greeks intuited about learning and human development. Research in developmental psychology confirms that the brain develops optimally in environments characterized by safety, trust, and meaningful relationships. Studies of neuroplasticity reveal that learning involves not just the acquisition of information, but the physical restructuring of neural pathways, a process that is enhanced by positive emotional states and hindered by chronic stress and fear. The Greeks' understanding of learning as a social process finds support in contemporary research on social cognition. We now know that the human brain is fundamentally social, shaped by our interactions with others from birth onward. Mirror neurons fire both when we perform an action and when we observe others performing the same action, creating a neurological basis for learning through imitation and identification. The Greeks' emphasis on learning through dialogue and relationship aligns perfectly with these findings about the social nature of cognition. Their holistic approach to education also resonates with current research on embodied cognition, the understanding that thinking involves not just the brain, but the entire body. The Greeks' integration of physical activity, emotional development, and intellectual growth reflects an intuitive grasp of what scientists now call the mind-body connection. Their practice of walking while discussing philosophical problems, their inclusion of physical exercise in educational curricula, and their attention to the emotional climate of learning environments all demonstrate an understanding of human psychology that modern education has only recently begun to rediscover. Perhaps most significantly, research on stress and learning reveals the profound damage caused by the fear-based educational approaches that emerged in the 1600s and persist today. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, impairing memory formation, reducing cognitive flexibility, and shutting down the very neural networks required for creative thinking and problem solving. The brutal treatment of apprentices in Renaissance Europe and its modern equivalents in toxic mentorship cultures literally damages the brain's capacity for learning. In contrast, environments characterized by psychological safety, where individuals feel free to ask questions, make mistakes, and express uncertainty, promote optimal brain function for learning. The release of dopamine and other neurotransmitters associated with positive emotions enhances memory consolidation increases motivation, and supports the kind of open, exploratory thinking that leads to genuine insight. The Greeks' emphasis on creating joyful, supportive learning environments was not just humane, it was neurologically sophisticated. The hormone oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, plays a crucial role in social learning and trust formation. Released during positive social interactions, oxytocin enhances the brain's capacity for empathy, cooperation, and social learning. The Greeks' emphasis on mentorship relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care would have promoted oxytocin release, creating optimal conditions for learning and development. In contrast, the fear-based relationships characteristic of brutal apprenticeship systems would have suppressed oxytocin while elevating stress hormones, creating precisely the wrong neurochemical environment for learning. Research on motivation reveals another aspect of Greek wisdom. Studies consistently show that intrinsic motivation, the drive that comes from genuine interest and personal satisfaction, is far more powerful and sustainable than extrinsic motivation based on rewards and punishments. The Greeks' emphasis on philosophia, the love of wisdom, cultivated intrinsic motivation by helping students discover their own curiosity and passion for learning. This stands in stark contrast to the coercive methods used in later educational systems, which rely on fear, shame, and external pressure to drive learning. The Greek understanding of learning as a lifelong process also aligns with modern research on adult development and neuroplasticity. We now know that the brain remains capable of growth and change throughout life, but this capacity is best maintained through continued learning, social engagement, and intellectual challenge. The Greeks' model of lifelong philosophical inquiry, where teachers continued to learn alongside students, reflects an understanding of human development that modern psychology has only recently validated. Contemporary research on wisdom, the integration of cognitive, emotional, and experiential knowledge, reveals another area where Greek insights anticipated modern science. Studies show that wisdom develops through reflection, dialogue, and the integration of multiple perspectives. The Greeks' emphasis on dialectical reasoning, their practice of examining life through philosophical dialogue, and their integration of intellectual and emotional development all promote the kind of reflective thinking that leads to wisdom. The environmental factors that shaped Greek learning communities reveal a sophisticated understanding of how physical spaces influence psychological states and cognitive function. Modern research on environmental psychology confirms that natural settings reduce stress, enhance attention, and promote creative thinking. The Greeks' choice to locate their schools in groves and gardens, their integration of natural beauty with intellectual pursuit, and their use of walking and movement as aids to thinking, all demonstrate an intuitive grasp of the relationship between environment and cognition. The biological rhythms that governed Greek educational practices also align with contemporary research on chronobiology and optimal learning. The Greeks' attention to natural cycles, their integration of physical activity with intellectual work, and their emphasis on balance and moderation reflect an understanding of human physiology that supports rather than undermines learning. This stands in stark contrast to the sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, and physical neglect that characterized brutal apprenticeship systems and continue to plague modern educational institutions. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks understood that learning is not just about acquiring information, but about developing wisdom, the capacity to live well and make good decisions. This understanding is supported by contemporary research on practical intelligence, emotional intelligence, and moral development. The Greeks' integration of ethical reflection with intellectual inquiry, their emphasis on character development alongside cognitive growth, and their understanding of education as preparation for life rather than just career preparation, all reflect a sophisticated understanding of human development that modern education has largely abandoned. The Greek approach to intellectual development was built on several interconnected pillars that worked together to create optimal conditions for learning and growth. Unlike the compartmentalized approach that would later dominate Western education, the Greeks understood that true learning required attention to multiple dimensions of human experience simultaneously. The environmental foundation of Greek education was perhaps its most immediately striking feature. The academy's olive groves and the Lyceum's tree-lined walkways were not merely pleasant backdrops, but integral components of the educational process. The Greeks understood intuitively what modern research has confirmed, that natural environments reduce cortisol levels, enhance attention, and promote the kind of relaxed awareness that facilitates learning. The dappled sunlight filtering through leaves, the sound of water flowing through carefully designed channels, and the fragrance of flowering plants all contributed to creating what we might now call an optimal learning environment. The architecture of these spaces reflected a deep understanding of how physical design influences psychological states, rather than the closed, hierarchical spaces that would characterize later educational institutions. Greek schools featured open, flowing designs that encouraged movement and interaction. The famous peripatetic method of teaching literally, walking around, was not just a pedagogical technique, but a recognition that physical movement enhances cognitive function. Modern neuroscience confirms that walking increases the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that promotes the growth of new neurons and synapses. The integration of gymnasium and school reflected the Greeks' understanding of the connection between physical and mental development. Students engaged in athletic training not as a separate activity, but as part of their intellectual education. They understood that a healthy body supports a healthy mind, that physical discipline develops mental discipline, and that the lessons learned in athletic training, perseverance, self-control, and graceful acceptance of both victory and defeat directly supported intellectual development. The temporal rhythms of Greek education also reveal sophisticated insights into human psychology and learning, rather than the rigid schedules that would later dominate educational institutions. Greek schools followed more natural rhythms. Learning activities were distributed throughout the day, integrated with meals, exercise, and social interaction. The Greeks understood that attention has natural cycles, that intensive intellectual work must be balanced with rest and recreation, and that learning is enhanced when it is woven into the fabric of daily life rather than segregated into artificial academic periods. The social structure of Greek philosophical communities represented perhaps their most revolutionary insight into human development. The relationship between teacher and student was not one of information transfer from a knowledgeable authority to an ignorant recipient, but rather a collaborative inquiry between fellow seekers. Teachers were not distant experts, but accessible guides who shared their own uncertainties and continued learning alongside their students. This approach recognized that learning is fundamentally social, that understanding develops through dialogue and debate, and that the best teachers are those who remain humble students themselves. The practice of dialectical reasoning, the systematic examination of ideas through question and answer, was not just a method of inquiry, but a way of developing critical thinking skills. Rather than simply accepting received wisdom, students were encouraged to question assumptions, explore contradictions, and develop their own understanding through active engagement with ideas. This approach cultivated intellectual independence while maintaining respect for tradition and authority. The Greeks' attention to emotional and psychological development, alongside intellectual growth, reflected their understanding that learning involves the whole person. They recognized that emotions are not obstacles to rational thinking, but essential components of it. Fear, anxiety, and shame impede learning, while curiosity, joy, and wonder enhance it. The emotional climate of Greek schools was carefully cultivated to promote the positive emotional states that support optimal learning. The integration of ethical and philosophical reflection into all aspects of education demonstrated the Greeks' understanding that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. They believed that intellectual development must be accompanied by moral development, that the capacity to think clearly must be balanced by the commitment to think responsibly. This approach produced not just skilled thinkers, but thoughtful human beings capable of using their knowledge in service of human flourishing. The Greeks' approach to feedback and correction was notably different from the punitive methods that would later dominate educational systems. Rather than using shame and punishment to correct errors, they treated mistakes as opportunities for learning and growth. The Socratic method, with its gentle probing and patient guidance, exemplified this approach. Students were helped to discover their own errors through guided reflection, rather than being humiliated or punished for them. The communal aspect of Greek education extended beyond the formal teacher-student relationship to include the entire community of learners. Students learned not just from their teachers, but from each other, engaging in peer dialogue, collaborative inquiry, and mutual support. This approach recognized that learning is enhanced when it occurs in community, that different perspectives enrich understanding, and that teaching others is one of the most powerful ways to deepen one's own learning. The Greeks' understanding of individual differences in learning styles and capacities was remarkably sophisticated. Rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all approach, they recognized that different students have different strengths, interests, and ways of learning. Teachers adapted their methods to individual students, providing personalized guidance while maintaining common standards and expectations. This individualized approach maximized each student's potential while fostering a sense of belonging and acceptance. The spiritual dimension of Greek education while not religious in the modern sense, recognized that learning involves questions of meaning and purpose that transcend immediate practical concerns. The pursuit of wisdom was understood to be a spiritual as well as intellectual journey, requiring not just mental effort, but personal transformation. This approach gave depth and significance to the educational process, connecting learning to the deepest human aspirations and concerns. The dawn was breaking over the olive groves of the academy as Alexios made his way along the familiar stone path, his simple chiton catching the morning breeze. At 17, he had been studying here for 3 years, and still felt a flutter of anticipation each morning as he approached the columned portico where his fellow students were already gathering. The soft murmur of conversation mixed with the sound of water from the fountain in the central courtyard, creating an atmosphere of calm expectancy that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Alexios paused at the fountain to splash cool water on his face, a ritual that had become second nature. Around him, other students were engaged in similar morning preparations, some stretching their limbs after the walk from the city, others reviewing notes written on wax tablets by lamplight the previous evening. There was no sense of urgency or anxiety, no fear of being late for a rigid schedule. The day would unfold according to its own rhythm, shaped by the interests and energy of the community rather than imposed from above. As the sun climbed higher, Plato emerged from his private quarters, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he greeted individual students by name. "Alexios, my young friend," he said, placing a gentle hand on the student's shoulder. "I've been thinking about your question yesterday regarding the nature of justice. Walk with me, and let's see if the morning air brings clarity to our inquiry." This was how learning began each day, not with formal lectures or rigid curricula, but with genuine curiosity and personal connection. They strolled together through the grove, their footsteps creating a gentle rhythm on the earthen path. Other small groups formed naturally around them, students clustering around different teachers, engaging in animated discussions that flowed from philosophy to mathematics to poetry without artificial boundaries. Alexios felt himself relaxing into the familiar pattern of questioning and exploration that characterized life at the academy. Here, he was not just a receptacle for information, but an active participant in the great conversation of human understanding. The morning's discussion led them to the gymnasium, where intellectual inquiry seamlessly blended with physical activity. As Alexios practiced wrestling with his peers, the lessons of the morning continued in a different form. The discipline required to master his body mirrored the discipline needed to master his mind. The grace needed to accept defeat gracefully paralleled the humility required to acknowledge intellectual mistakes. The strength needed for athletic competition was the same strength needed to pursue truth, even when it challenged comfortable assumptions. After the midday meal, shared communally under the shade of ancient olive trees, Alexios found himself in a smaller group discussing the morning's insights. Here, in the dappled sunlight, with the sound of bees humming in the flowering shrubs nearby, learning felt as natural as breathing. His teacher listened as carefully to his tentative ideas as to those of more advanced students, treating each contribution as potentially valuable while gently guiding the discussion toward deeper understanding. The afternoon brought different activities, sometimes focused study of texts, sometimes mathematical investigations, sometimes poetic composition, but always the emphasis was on understanding rather than mere memorization, on developing wisdom rather than just accumulating information. When Alexios struggled with a difficult concept, his teacher didn't berate him for his slowness, but helped him find his own path to understanding. When he made an error, it was treated as a stepping stone to greater clarity rather than a cause for shame. As evening approached, Alexios participated in the communal meal, where students and teachers shared food, stories, and continued intellectual discussion in a relaxed, familial atmosphere. The boundaries between formal education and daily life dissolved completely. Learning happened in conversation over meals, in quiet moments of reflection in the garden, in the casual exchanges between friends walking home under the stars. 600 miles to the west, in a small coastal town in southern Italy, Sophia began her day in the Pythagorean community with the traditional morning silence. As the sun painted the Mediterranean sky in shades of rose and gold, she and her fellow students gathered in the central courtyard, spending the first hour of each day in contemplative stillness. This was not empty silence, but pregnant quietude, time for the mind to settle, for the soul to prepare for the day's investigations into the mysteries of number, harmony, and the cosmic order. The Pythagorean approach to learning differed from that of the academy, but shared the same fundamental respect for the whole human being. Here, intellectual inquiry was inseparable from spiritual development, mathematical understanding from moral purification, and theoretical knowledge from practical wisdom. Sophia, one of the few women allowed to participate fully in the community's intellectual life, felt the weight and privilege of this inclusion deeply. After the morning silence, the community gathered for the day's first instruction. But unlike the harsh lecturing that would characterize later educational systems, this took the form of gentle guidance and collaborative inquiry. The teacher, whether male or female, for the Pythagoreans were remarkably egalitarian in their approach to wisdom, began not with answers, but with questions that awakened wonder and curiosity. Sophia's particular gift lay in understanding the mathematical harmonies that the Pythagoreans believed governed the universe. As she worked with ratios and proportions, she felt herself participating in the fundamental order of creation. The numbers were not abstract concepts, but living realities that connected her to the music of the spheres, the architecture of the cosmos, and the deep structures of reality itself. This was learning as revelation, education as initiation into the mysteries of existence. The community's approach to correction and guidance was as gentle as it was thorough. When Sophia made an error in her mathematical reasoning, her teacher didn't shame or punish her, but helped her discover the mistake through patient questioning. "Tell me, Sophia," the teacher might say, "what happens when we examine this ratio more closely? What patterns do you notice?" This method allowed her to maintain her dignity while learning from her mistakes, fostering a love of learning rather than a fear of failure. The integration of practical and theoretical learning was seamless in the Pythagorean community. Sophia's mathematical studies informed her understanding of music. She could hear the numerical relationships in harmonious intervals, and understand why certain combinations of notes created consonance while others created dissonance. Her grasp of proportion influenced her appreciation of architecture and visual art. Her understanding of cosmic harmony shaped her approach to ethics and personal conduct. The communal meals were times of both nourishment and education. Food was prepared and shared according to principles that reflected the community's philosophical commitments. The careful attention to diet was not mere asceticism, but recognition that the body's condition affects the mind's capacity for learning. Simple, pure foods supported clear thinking and spiritual development. Even the arrangement of the meal reflected mathematical principles of harmony and proportion. In the evening, as the community gathered for reflection and discussion, Sophia felt herself part of something larger than individual learning. The insights gained by each member enriched the understanding of all. Knowledge was not hoarded, but shared, not owned, but held in common trust. The competitive individualism that would later characterize educational institutions was entirely absent here. Success was measured not by triumph over others, but by progress toward wisdom and the contribution one could make to the common good. The contrast between these ancient models of learning and what emerged in the Orgy 1600s reveals the profound tragedy of how education was transformed from a humanizing force into a dehumanizing one. In the cellars and workshops of Renaissance Europe, young apprentices like Theodore experienced learning as trauma rather than joy, mentorship as exploitation rather than guidance, and knowledge as something to be extracted through suffering rather than cultivated through care. The transformation was gradual but relentless. The medieval guild system, which had provided some protection and structure for apprentices, began to break down under the pressure of new economic forces and changing social structures. The rise of individual genius as a cultural ideal shifted focus from collaborative inquiry to competitive achievement. The increasing complexity of scientific instruments and procedures created new opportunities for exploitation, as masters could justify brutal treatment in the name of technical precision and professional standards. In workshops across Europe, young people found themselves trapped in relationships that bore no resemblance to the nurturing mentorship of ancient philosophical schools. They were awakened before dawn to begin dangerous work with toxic substances, often without proper instruction or safety precautions. They were beaten for asking questions, starved for making mistakes, and worked to exhaustion in pursuit of their master's ambitions. The love of wisdom that had motivated ancient students was replaced by fear of punishment, and the joy of discovery was overshadowed by the terror of failure. The scientific revolution, for all its genuine achievements, was built on the broken bodies and spirits of countless young apprentices whose names history has forgotten. Behind every famous discovery stood unnamed assistants who mixed the chemicals, ground the lenses, and recorded the observations that made breakthrough possible. Yet these young people received no credit for their contributions, no recognition for their sacrifices, and no consideration for their well-being. The brutality was not incidental, but integral to the system. Masters believed that suffering was necessary for learning. That hardship built character, and that the apprentice's comfort was irrelevant compared to the advancement of knowledge. This philosophy represented a complete inversion of the ancient understanding of learning as a joyful process of discovery and growth. Instead of environments designed to nurture human potential, workshops became spaces of exploitation and abuse. The isolation of apprentices from broader intellectual communities further compounded their suffering. Unlike the students in ancient philosophical schools, who learned in community with peers and engaged in dialogue with multiple teachers, apprentices were often isolated with single masters, whose personalities and prejudices shaped their entire educational experience. When those masters were unstable, cruel, or simply incompetent, apprentices had no recourse and no alternative perspectives to balance their influence. The secrecy that surrounded much 17th century research added another layer of difficulty to the apprentice's situation. Unlike the open inquiry that characterized ancient philosophical schools, much scientific work was conducted in secret, hidden from religious authorities, political rivals, or commercial competitors. This secrecy created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made genuine learning almost impossible. Apprentices could not discuss their work with others, could not seek help when they encountered difficulties, and could not verify whether their treatment was normal or abusive. The economic exploitation of apprentices reached levels that would have been unthinkable in ancient philosophical communities. While Greek students might contribute to the maintenance of their schools through various forms of service, this work was understood as part of their education and was balanced with intellectual development and personal care. 17th century apprentices, by contrast, were often treated as unpaid laborers whose primary value lay in their ability to perform dangerous or tedious tasks that their masters preferred to avoid. The psychological damage inflicted by these brutal systems was profound and lasting. Young people who entered apprenticeships with curiosity and enthusiasm often emerged traumatized and broken, their love of learning replaced by cynicism and fear. Many never recovered from the abuse they suffered, carrying the scars of their educational experience throughout their lives. Others perpetuated this cycle by becoming harsh masters themselves, believing that brutality was simply the price of knowledge. The gender dynamics of 17th century apprenticeship were particularly harsh. While ancient communities like the Pythagoreans had included women in their intellectual life, the emerging scientific culture of the 1600s was aggressively masculine and often violently misogynistic. Young women who sought to participate in intellectual life, like our fictional Lena, faced not only the ordinary brutalities of the apprentice system, but additional dangers related to their gender. They risked accusations of witchcraft, sexual exploitation, and social ostracism for daring to seek knowledge in a culture that viewed female intellectual curiosity as fundamentally threatening. The religious persecution that characterized much of 17th century Europe added yet another layer of danger to the apprentice's situation. Unlike the relatively tolerant atmosphere of ancient philosophical schools, where different ideas could be explored and debated without fear of persecution, the workshops of Renaissance Europe operated under the constant threat of religious authority. Apprentices who assisted in research that challenged orthodox religious teachings risked not only their master's displeasure, but also imprisonment, torture, and death at the hands of religious authorities. The contrast between these two approaches to learning reveals not just different pedagogical methods, but fundamentally different conceptions of human nature and potential. The ancient Greeks viewed human beings as naturally curious creatures who flourished in environments of trust, respect, and intellectual freedom. They understood that learning is a collaborative enterprise that requires community, dialogue, and mutual support. They recognized that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, and that intellectual development must be balanced with moral and emotional growth. The brutal apprenticeship systems of the 1600s, by contrast, were based on a deeply pessimistic view of human nature. They assumed that young people were naturally lazy, stupid, and rebellious, requiring harsh discipline and constant supervision to learn anything at all. They treated knowledge as a scarce resource to be hoarded by masters and extracted from students through force. They separated intellectual development from moral and emotional growth, creating a fragmented approach to education that served neither knowledge nor humanity well. This historical transformation has left deep scars on our contemporary educational culture. Even today, we continue to wrestle with the legacy of these brutal systems, struggling to create learning environments that honor both knowledge and the knower, that value both intellectual rigor and human well-being. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone seeking to develop more humane and effective approaches to education and mentorship. The shadow of the 17th century apprenticeship system extends far beyond its historical boundaries, casting a long and dark influence over contemporary educational and professional cultures. Today's graduate students, medical residents, legal associates, and corporate interns often find themselves trapped in relationships that bear striking resemblance to the exploitative dynamics that characterized the workshops of Renaissance Europe. The language has changed, but the fundamental structure remains. Young people surrendering years of their lives to older authorities who control their future prospects, often enduring abuse in the name of professional development and career advancement. In modern universities, the phenomenon of graduate student exploitation has reached epidemic proportions. Doctoral students routinely work 70-hour weeks for stipends that fall below the poverty line, conduct research that advances their advisors' careers while receiving minimal credit, and endure psychological abuse disguised as academic rigor. The rhetoric of apprenticeship and mentorship obscures relationships that are often fundamentally exploitative, where students' well-being is sacrificed to faculty members' research agendas and professional ambitions. The medical profession provides perhaps the most glaring example of how brutal training methods have been institutionalized and rationalized. Medical residents routinely work shifts of 36 hours or longer, making life and death decisions while severely sleep-deprived. They are subjected to verbal abuse, public humiliation, and psychological intimidation that would be considered criminal in other contexts. The justification is always the same. Suffering builds character. Adversity creates competence, and the stakes are too high to coddle trainees. Yet research consistently shows that these methods impair rather than enhance learning, increase rather than decrease medical errors, and produce physicians who are more likely to suffer from depression, addiction, and suicide. The legal profession has similarly institutionalized practices that echo the worst aspects of 17th century apprenticeship. First-year associates at major law firms are expected to bill 80 hours per week or more, often working through the night on projects that may be discarded without explanation. They are subjected to harsh criticism, impossible deadlines, and constant pressure while being paid salaries that, calculated on an hourly basis, often fall below minimum wage. The promise of future partnership justifies present exploitation, just as the promise of future mastery justified the abuse of Renaissance apprentices. Corporate internship programs have become particularly sophisticated in their exploitation of young workers. Unpaid internships, which would have been illegal in most historical contexts, are now commonplace and often required for entry into many professions. Young people are expected to work full-time for months or even years without compensation, gaining experience that primarily benefits their employers rather than themselves. The rhetoric of opportunity and networking disguises relationships that are fundamentally extractive. The technology industry, despite its rhetoric of innovation and disruption, has reproduced many of the worst aspects of traditional apprenticeship systems. Young programmers and designers often find themselves in crunch cultures where 100-hour work weeks are normal, where sleep deprivation is worn as a badge of honor, and where burnout is treated as a personal failing rather than a systemic problem. The promise of equity or stock options justifies present exploitation, just as the promise of eventual mastery justified the suffering of historical apprentices. Academic research has revealed the profound psychological and physical costs of these modern apprenticeship systems. Studies of graduate student mental health show rates of depression and anxiety that far exceed those of the general population. Research on medical resident well-being reveals epidemic levels of burnout, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. Investigations into workplace culture at major corporations document patterns of abuse, discrimination, and exploitation that would have been familiar to apprentices in the 1600s. The gender and racial dynamics of modern exploitation are particularly troubling. Women and minorities in these systems face not only the ordinary pressures of competitive professional environments, but additional burdens related to discrimination, harassment, and exclusion. Just as female apprentices in the 17th century faced unique dangers, women in contemporary professional settings must navigate sexual harassment, gender bias, and the additional emotional labor of constantly proving their competence and commitment. A normalization of these exploitative practices through cultural narratives of paying dues and earning stripes reveals how successfully the brutal apprenticeship model has been integrated into contemporary professional culture. Young people are taught to expect and accept abuse as the natural price of professional development, to view their suffering as character building rather than exploitation, and to perpetuate the cycle by treating those who come after them with the same harshness they themselves endured. The digital age has added new dimensions to this exploitation while maintaining its fundamental structure. Email and smartphones have eliminated the boundaries between work and personal life that once provided some protection for apprentices and junior employees. The expectation of constant availability means that modern apprentices never truly escape their master's demands, carrying their subjugation with them into every aspect of their lives. Social media has created new forms of professional surveillance and control, where young people's personal expressions and relationships are monitored and policed by those who control their career prospects. The gig economy has further eroded the protections that once existed for young workers, creating a vast class of freelancers and contractors who bear all the risks of employment while receiving none of its benefits. These modern apprentices work without health insurance, vacation time, or job security, constantly competing against each other for temporary positions that offer little opportunity for advancement or skill development. The rhetoric of entrepreneurship and flexibility disguises relationships that are often more exploitative than traditional employment. The student debt crisis has created a form of indentured servitude that would have been familiar to apprentices in earlier eras. Young people mortgage their futures for educational credentials that may never provide sufficient income to repay their loans, trapping them in cycles of debt that can last decades. The promise of education as a path to prosperity has become, for many, a trap that provides primarily enrichment for educational institutions and their creditors. Social media has also created new forms of comparison and competition that amplify the psychological pressure on young people navigating these systems. The carefully curated success stories that dominate platforms like LinkedIn and Instagram create unrealistic expectations and constant feelings of inadequacy. Young people compare their private struggles with others' public achievements, not realizing that the apparent success they see online often masks similar struggles with exploitation, abuse, and mental health challenges. The pandemic revealed both the fragility and the brutality of these modern apprenticeship systems. Many young people found themselves abandoned by mentors and institutions when economic pressures mounted. Their learning opportunities revealed as primarily exploitative relationships that were quickly discarded when convenient. Others faced increased demands and pressure as remote work eliminated even the informal protections that physical presence once provided. The mental health crisis that emerged during this period disproportionately affected young people who were already struggling with exploitative educational and professional relationships. The contrast with ancient approaches to mentorship becomes even starker when we consider how modern technology could be used to create more humane and effective learning environments. Instead of using digital tools to increase surveillance and control, we could use them to facilitate collaboration, democratize access to knowledge, and create supportive learning communities. Instead of using connectivity to eliminate boundaries between work and personal life, we could use it to create more flexible and sustainable approaches to professional development. The ancient Greeks understood that sustainable learning requires sustainable relationships, that genuine mastery emerges from joy rather than suffering, and that the best teachers are those who continue learning alongside their students. These insights remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago, offering us a path toward educational and professional cultures that serve human flourishing rather than exploit it. The transformation from the nurturing mentorship of ancient philosophical schools to the exploitative systems that emerged in the 17th century and persist today was not inevitable. It resulted from specific historical choices about the nature of knowledge, the purpose of education, and the value of human beings. Understanding this history reveals that our current systems are not natural or necessary, but constructed and changeable. The psychological research that validates ancient Greek insights about learning also provides a roadmap for creating better systems. We know that learning is enhanced by psychological safety, intrinsic motivation, and supportive relationships. We understand that stress and fear impair cognitive function, while joy and curiosity enhance it. We recognize that sustainable high performance requires balance, rest, and genuine care for the whole person. These findings provide scientific support for approaches to mentorship and education that honor both knowledge and the knower. The economic arguments for maintaining exploitative systems are increasingly difficult to defend. Research consistently shows that organizations with more humane cultures outperform those that rely on fear and exploitation. Countries with more supportive educational systems produce better outcomes across multiple measures of well-being and achievement. The supposed trade-off between excellence and humanity is revealed as a false choice, based on outdated assumptions about human nature and motivation. Yet change remains difficult because the current systems serve the interests of those who control them, even as they damage those who must navigate them. Professors benefit from graduate student labor, even when students suffer. Law firm partners profit from associate exploitation, even when it damages the profession's reputation and effectiveness. Corporate executives maximize short-term profits through intern labor, even when it creates long-term problems with talent development and organizational culture. The benefits are concentrated among those with power, while the costs are borne by those without it. Breaking these cycles requires both individual and collective action. At the individual level, those in positions of authority must choose to model different approaches to mentorship and leadership, creating pockets of humanity within systems that often reward cruelty. At the collective level, we need new institutions, policies, and cultural norms that prioritize human development alongside professional achievement. The ancient Greeks offer us not just criticism of current systems, but positive vision of what better alternatives might look like. Their approaches to mentorship, learning, and human development provide concrete models that can be adapted to contemporary contexts. Understanding their methods offers hope that we can create educational and professional cultures worthy of human dignity and potential. The lessons we can draw from ancient Greek mentorship practices are neither simple nor simplistic, but they offer profound guidance for anyone seeking to create more humane and effective approaches to learning and development. These lessons emerge not from romantic idealization of the past, but from careful examination of practices that produced remarkable results while honoring human dignity and potential. The first and perhaps most fundamental lesson concerns the creation of psychological safety in learning environments. The Greeks understood that genuine learning requires an atmosphere where students feel safe to ask questions, make mistakes, and express uncertainty without fear of punishment or humiliation. This principle directly contradicts the fear-based approaches that characterized 17th century apprenticeships and continue to plague modern educational and professional settings. Creating psychological safety begins with the recognition that mistakes are not character flaws, but essential components of the learning process. When students know that errors will be met with curiosity rather than condemnation, they become more willing to take intellectual risks, engage with challenging material, and push the boundaries of their understanding. This requires mentors to model intellectual humility, acknowledging their own uncertainties and continuing learning rather than presenting themselves as infallible authorities. The Greek emphasis on dialogue and collaborative inquiry offers another crucial lesson for contemporary mentorship. Rather than treating learning as the transmission of information from knowledgeable teachers to ignorant students, the Greeks understood it as a collaborative process of discovery. This approach honors the intelligence and potential of learners while recognizing that teachers themselves continue to grow through engagement with students' questions and insights. Implementing this approach requires a fundamental shift in power dynamics within mentoring relationships. Instead of authoritarian structures, where mentors control all aspects of the learning process, collaborative mentorship involves shared authority, mutual respect, and genuine partnership in the pursuit of understanding. This doesn't mean abandoning all structure or guidance, but rather creating frameworks that support student agency while providing appropriate scaffolding and support. The integration of physical, emotional, and intellectual development that characterized Greek education offers important insights for contemporary practice. Modern educational and professional systems often treat the mind as separate from the body and emotions, leading to approaches that neglect crucial aspects of human well-being and actually impair learning and performance. Practical applications of this insight might include incorporating movement and physical activity into learning environments, paying attention to nutrition and sleep as factors that affect cognitive function, and recognizing that emotional states profoundly influence intellectual capacity. This doesn't require elaborate programs or expensive interventions, but rather systematic attention to the conditions that support human flourishing. The Greek understanding of learning as a lifelong process offers another valuable lesson. Rather than treating education as something that happens to young people before they enter real life, the Greeks recognized that wisdom develops throughout the lifespan, and that the best teachers are those who continue learning. This perspective has profound implications for how we structure mentoring relationships and professional development programs. Lifelong learning approaches might involve creating communities of practice where people at different stages of development learn from each other, rotating mentoring relationships so that individuals sometimes teach and sometimes learn, and recognizing that expertise in one area doesn't necessarily translate to wisdom in all areas of life. This approach reduces the isolation and hierarchy that characterize many current mentoring systems while creating more robust and sustainable learning communities. The attention to individual differences that characterized Greek education offers guidance for creating more personalized and effective mentoring relationships. Rather than imposing one-size-fits-all approaches, Effective mentors recognize that different people have different learning styles, interests, and developmental needs. This requires flexibility, patience, and genuine attention to each individual's unique characteristics and potential. Personalized mentoring doesn't mean abandoning standards or expectations, but rather finding multiple pathways to achieve common goals. It involves helping individuals discover their own strengths and interests while providing support in areas where they need additional development. This approach maximizes individual potential while maintaining collective standards and shared purposes. The Greek integration of ethical and intellectual development provides crucial guidance for mentoring in professional contexts. The Greeks understood that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that technical competence must be balanced with moral development, and that the ultimate purpose of education is to enable people to live well and contribute to the common good. Contemporary applications of this insight might involve explicitly discussing ethical dimensions of professional practice, modeling ethical decision-making in mentoring relationships, and helping mentees develop not just technical skills, but also the judgment and character needed to use those skills responsibly. This approach treats professional development as part of broader human development rather than as separate from it. The environmental factors that supported Greek learning offer practical guidance for creating better physical and social spaces for education and professional development. The Greeks' attention to natural beauty, their integration of indoor and outdoor spaces, and their creation of environments that supported both focused work and relaxed interaction all contributed to optimal learning conditions. Modern applications might include designing learning spaces that incorporate natural light and plants, creating opportunities for movement and informal interaction, and paying attention to acoustics, temperature, and other environmental factors that affect well-being and performance. These changes need not be expensive or elaborate, but they require systematic attention to how physical environments support or hinder human flourishing. The Greek emphasis on community and relationship offers perhaps the most important lesson for contemporary practice. Learning and development happen best in the context of supportive communities where individuals feel valued, connected, and engaged in shared purposes. This insight contradicts the competitive individualism that characterizes many current educational and professional systems. Building learning communities requires intentional effort to create structures and practices that support relationship building, collaboration, and mutual support. This might involve regular community meetings, peer mentoring programs, shared meals, or social activities, and explicit attention to group dynamics and inclusive practices. The goal is to create environments where individual success is linked to collective well-being rather than achieved at others' expense. The Greek understanding of intrinsic motivation offers guidance for creating sustainable approaches to learning and development. Rather than relying primarily on external rewards and punishments, effective mentoring cultivates genuine curiosity, passion, and commitment to growth. This requires helping individuals connect their learning to their own interests, values, and aspirations rather than simply to external requirements or expectations. Cultivating intrinsic motivation involves creating opportunities for autonomy, mastery, and purpose in learning relationships. It means providing appropriate challenges that stretch individuals without overwhelming them, offering choices about how to approach learning tasks, and helping people understand how their development serves larger purposes they care about. The Greek approach to feedback and correction offers valuable lessons for contemporary mentoring practice. Rather than using criticism to shame or punish, effective feedback helps individuals learn from mistakes and continue developing. This requires skill in providing specific, actionable guidance while maintaining respect and support for the person receiving feedback. Effective feedback focuses on behaviors and outcomes rather than character, provides specific examples and suggestions for improvement, and balances recognition of strengths with identification of areas for growth. Most importantly, it's delivered in the context of ongoing supportive relationships, rather than as isolated judgment or evaluation. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Greek approach to mentorship was grounded in genuine care for the whole person and commitment to their flourishing. This care was not sentimental or permissive, but rather involved high expectations combined with strong support. It recognized that people are more likely to achieve excellence when they feel valued and supported than when they are threatened or coerced. Contemporary mentoring relationships that embody this spirit involve genuine interest in mentees as whole human beings, not just as sources of labor or reflections of mentor success. They require mentors to invest time and energy in understanding individual needs, providing appropriate challenges and support, and modeling the kind of professional and personal excellence they hope to cultivate in others. These lessons from ancient Greek mentorship practices are not mere historical curiosities, but practical wisdom that can transform contemporary approaches to education, professional development, and human relationships. They offer hope that we can create learning communities worthy of human dignity and potential, environments where people can develop both competence and character, and relationships that serve human flourishing rather than exploit it. The implementation of these insights requires both individual commitment and collective action. It demands that those in positions of authority choose to model different approaches to leadership and mentorship, even when current systems reward exploitation and abuse. It requires institutions to examine their practices and policies in light of what we know about human learning and development. Most importantly, it calls for a fundamental shift in how we understand the purpose of education and professional development, from systems designed to sort and exploit people to communities dedicated to human flourishing and the common good. As we stand at the threshold of an uncertain future, facing challenges that require both technical competence and ethical wisdom, the ancient Greek vision of mentorship as collaborative inquiry in service of human flourishing offers guidance that is both practical and profound. Their insights remind us that the best teachers are those who continue learning, that sustainable excellence emerges from joy rather than suffering, and that the ultimate purpose of all human development is to enable people to live well and contribute to the welfare of their communities. In a world that often seems to have forgotten these fundamental truths, the example of ancient Greek mentorship practices offers both critique of current systems and hope for better alternatives. It reminds us that the relationships through which we learn and grow are among the most important factors shaping both individual lives and collective futures. By understanding how these relationships can be structured to honor both knowledge and the knower, we take important steps toward creating communities worthy of human dignity and potential. The story that began with Theodore's suffering in a 17th century cellar and Alexius's joy in an ancient Athenian grove is ultimately our story, a story about how we choose to treat each other in the fundamental human activities of learning and growing. The ancient Greeks offer us a vision of how these activities can be conducted with both excellence and humanity, providing not just criticism of what has gone wrong, but positive guidance for what might yet go right. In the end, the choice between exploitation and flourishing in mentoring relationships is not just about educational policy or professional practice, but about the kind of society we want to create and the kinds of human beings we want to become. The ancient Greeks understood that these choices have consequences that extend far beyond individual relationships to shape the character of entire civilizations. Their wisdom calls us to choose carefully, thoughtfully, and with full awareness of our responsibility to those who will come after us. The legacy of mentorship, whether nurturing or exploitative, extends across generations, shaping not only individual lives, but the very fabric of human culture and progress. When we trace the lines of influence from ancient Greek philosophical schools through the brutal workshops of the 17th century to the complex challenges of contemporary education and professional development, we see clearly that the methods we use to cultivate human potential have consequences that ripple through history. The students who learned in the groves of the academy and the covered walkways of the Lyceum carried with them not only knowledge, but ways of being in relationship with knowledge and with other people. They became teachers themselves, passing on not only specific philosophical doctrines, but approaches to inquiry, relationship, and human development that shaped Western civilization for centuries. The humane methods they experienced became templates for how they would treat their own students, creating positive cycles that sustained intellectual and cultural progress across generations. Similarly, the apprentices who survived the brutal systems of the 17th century often carried their trauma forward, becoming harsh masters themselves because they knew no other way. The exploitation they experienced became normalized, justified, and perpetuated, creating negative cycles that continue to influence educational and professional cultures centuries later. The damage done to individual apprentices was compounded as they repeated patterns of abuse with those who came after them. This historical perspective reveals the profound responsibility that comes with any mentoring relationship. Every interaction between mentor and student, every decision about how to structure learning environments, every choice about whether to prioritize human dignity or immediate results, contributes to patterns that will influence countless future relationships. We are not just teaching specific skills or knowledge, but modeling ways of being human that will be passed on to others. The current crisis in mentorship and professional development represents both danger and opportunity. The widespread recognition of problems with exploitative systems creates openings for different approaches, while the persistence of these problems demonstrates how deeply entrenched they have become. The choice we face is not between easy alternatives, but between fundamentally different visions of human nature, learning, and community. The path forward requires both wisdom and courage to understand what has gone wrong and why, and courage to choose different approaches, even when they challenge established power structures and cultural norms. It requires individuals in positions of authority to model better approaches, even when they are not rewarded for doing so, and collective action to create institutions and policies that support human flourishing rather than exploit it. The ancient Greeks remind us that this transformation is possible because they actually achieved it. Their philosophical schools were not utopian fantasies, but real communities that successfully integrated intellectual rigor with human dignity, individual development with collective well-being, and the pursuit of knowledge with the cultivation of wisdom. Their example proves that alternatives to exploitative systems are not only desirable but achievable. Yet their example also reminds us that such achievements are fragile and must be continually renewed. The Greek philosophical schools themselves eventually declined, partly because later generations failed to maintain the values and practices that had made them successful. The transformation from nurturing mentorship to brutal exploitation was not sudden but gradual, the result of countless small choices that eventually added up to fundamentally different systems. This historical perspective suggests that creating sustainable change requires not only initial transformation, but ongoing commitment to maintaining the values and practices that support human flourishing. It requires constant vigilance against the forces that tend to corrupt mentoring relationships' competitiveness, status anxiety, resource scarcity, and the temptation to treat people as means rather than ends in themselves. The contemporary moment offers unique opportunities for this kind of transformation. Our understanding of human psychology and learning has advanced far beyond what was available to either the ancient Greeks or the 17th century scientific revolutionaries. We have resources, technologies, and global networks that could support more effective and humane approaches to education and professional development. Most importantly, we have growing awareness of the costs of exploitative systems and increasing demand for alternatives. Yet realizing these opportunities requires more than good intentions or technological solutions. It requires fundamental changes in how we understand success, how we structure incentives, and how we relate to each other in contexts of learning and development. It requires courage to challenge systems that serve the interests of those in power while exploiting those who are vulnerable. The story of mentorship from ancient Greece to the present day is ultimately a story about power, how it is used, how it is justified, and how it shapes human relationships and possibilities. The Greeks demonstrated that power in educational relationships can be used to nurture and empower rather than to dominate and exploit. The brutal systems that emerged later show how power can be corrupted and how that corruption damages both those who wield it and those who suffer under it. Today, we face choices about how to use the power we have in educational and professional relationships. Those choices will determine not only immediate outcomes for current students and mentees, but the kinds of systems and cultures we pass on to future generations. The ancient Greeks offer us both inspiration and practical guidance for making those choices wisely. Their legacy reminds us that the most important question is not whether we can create better system. We know that we can, but whether we will choose to do so. The answer to that question depends on our willingness to prioritize long-term human flourishing over short-term convenience, to value relationship and community over individual achievement, and to see education and professional development as fundamentally about becoming more fully human, rather than simply acquiring marketable skills. In the end, a choice between the nurturing mentorship exemplified by ancient Greek philosophical schools and the exploitative relationships that have too often replaced them is a choice about what we value most and what kind of world we want to create. The Greeks understood that these choices have consequences far beyond immediate relationships. They shape the character of individuals, communities, and entire civilizations. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, requiring both technical competence and ethical wisdom, the ancient Greek vision of mentorship as collaborative inquiry and service of human flourishing offers guidance that is both timeless and urgently contemporary. Their example reminds us that the relationships through which we learn and grow are among the most powerful forces shaping human possibilities, and that we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to structure those relationships in ways that honor the dignity and potential of every person involved. The story that began in the groves of ancient Athens and leads through the workshops of 17th century Europe to the classrooms and offices of today is not yet finished. We are all participants in writing the next chapters, and the choices we make about how to treat each other in contexts of learning and development will determine whether those chapters tell stories of exploitation and diminishment or of flourishing and growth. The ancient Greeks have shown us that the latter is possible. Whether we achieve it depends on the courage and wisdom we bring to the fundamental human work of helping each other learn and grow.